Images from print ads are reinterpreted and reborn in playful and striking compositions. They extend beyond the boundaries of the four sides of canvas to walls, floors, and windows, making us stop, think, and reconsider the impact of media images we see every day. On this edition of Art Now, we'll look at the work of Michael Willett.
Welcome to Art Now, a program where we talk to artists whose work is part of our community. I'm Pat Sammann, and I'll be your host. Our guest today is Michael Willett, a mixed media artist. He has a BFA from the University of Montevallo and an MFA degree from the University of Cincinnati. Presently, he is a visiting assistant professor in the art department at Eastern Illinois University. His work has been exhibited in Hong Kong, New York, and Philadelphia, as well as at the South Bend Museum of Art in South Bend, Indiana. Michael, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. Now, your work focuses on reinterpretation of advertising images using mixed media. Given that, were your first experiences with art with more traditional media, or did you start out with computer-based composition?
No, I mean, it was definitely traditional-based media. I feel like it's only recently have I become interested in the computer. It's not just an artistic medium, but a tool for artists.
Yeah.
Both my BFA and MFA are in painting.
Oh, okay.
And even before that, I've been classically trained and practiced for a while as a photorealist painter.
Oh, okay.
I did a lot of figurative painting and portrait painting. But even before that, I remember as a kid, doing a lot of drawing, and my parents recognized a talent at an early age, and they really not only encouraged me, but helped me nourish that talent. So they got me in private lessons after school, and that was private painting lessons. That was working with traditional media and kind of traditional instruction. But beyond that, I think when you start to look at my images, I think my experience in painting definitely shows in the work. And I know we'll look at some images here in a minute, but I think the time and the precise hand that it takes to cut out all these vinyl shapes is really the same skills that it takes to paint realistically. Just instead of using a tiny brush, I'm using an X-Acto blade.
Right.
And I think even beyond that, collage has become a very big kind of part of my studio practice. And in reality, collage is a pretty traditional form of kind of work in terms of compositional development, and that's, you can trace it all the way back to Renaissance artists kind of working in collage. But I think I reached a point where I was starting to think outside the box a little, and I like the idea of the medium itself can hold the content and help influence, help inform viewers of kind of meaning within the work, and that's something you can't always get with painting.
Yeah.
Or traditional media.
Yeah, makes sense. I also wanted to note that in your artist statement, you say that your goal as an artist is to challenge the fundamental conventions of picture making, and I think that our audience is going to see that that goal is definitely reflected in your work as we go through.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. I mean, I hope that's a good thing.
Well, I think so.
Yeah, well, it's the funny thing is that I teach in foundations, which for the most part is completely conventional. I mean, in terms of working with traditional media and teaching techniques and design elements and principles. But I think you reach a point when your art matures and you realize that kind of taking the safe route isn't really good enough anymore, and you have to not only break rules but start to create rules of your own.
Right.
And I think this is especially true for any kind of young artist working. I think it's someone who wants to really add something to conversation, because art has really such a long history and so much has already been done.
Right.
So. Absolutely.
Okay, let's start with a few images from your 2008 exhibition entitled Get Innocuous, which I really like. And then this was located in the Pipeline Artist Space in Cincinnati. We're going to look at this first image, and these are made of hand-cut vinyl. One thing that strikes me about these is that the images seem like they've already escaped from any traditional boundaries of canvas. They all seem to be alive, and they're kind of evolving as they move.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the whole idea, when conceiving the project. I think my own ambitions kind of took me off the canvas and wanted to work directly on the wall. And a part of this is from my own interest in graffiti art and mural painting, but not only that, installation art. So I was kind of thinking about how can, how can I use painting to change the way one either perceives or kind of experiences a given space. So I want to create this composition that kind of started out on the ground, started out on the wall, then eventually kind of moved down to the ground, and then slowly start to creep up another wall, and then jump across to another wall. And there's actually other images that we're not quite seeing that it's completely in the round and starts to work its way up on the canvas. So I like the idea of the viewer almost being inside this really large abstract painting. But the process, I started out by, at the time I was collecting a lot of, photographing a lot of these kind of paint drips and paint splats, these kind of accidental marks I would find around my studio. So I'd photograph them and start to categorize them. And I like the idea of creating this inventory to work with, and that kind of serves as this visual vocabulary to kind of speak with. So from there I would project these paint splats, draw them out, and then hand cut them out of this vinyl adhesive paper, which is essentially the same thing as like a material that's used for bumper stickers, kind of decals, and it's normally machine cut for window lettering for window signage. So I was starting to make this connection with kind of commercial culture and signage, which ends up playing a bigger role in future projects. Right. But I know a big part of the concept of working with this project. I wanted to work with the idea of taking kind of bits and pieces from art history, kind of sampling these elements and combining them together. So I think with the paint drip, there's obvious kind of references to Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism, but then combining it with a lot of the design power of pop art and advertising, which is kind of interesting because they're complete opposites of one another. Pop art was really the rebellion against abstract expressionism. So that was part of the idea. So there's like this subtle paradox, which I've kind of found interesting. But in doing this project, it really sparked this interest in design and bringing design to the forefront, which has really kind of changed the practice. And it really got me interested in collage, which that's what I've kind of shifted towards doing now.
Okay. This next exhibition called Pattern Recognition, which was shown in the Clifton Cultural Arts Center in Cincinnati in 2009. The hand-cut vinyl images are again kind of migrating around the space, but this time they're on windows and columns. And here, a number of the images we're going to see are also starting to come from the advertising cut. Yeah.
Well, I knew with my previous project, I was starting to make this connection with signage, based on working with vinyl. Right. But this time I wanted to address advertising in a more direct way. So I made the effort and kind of searched out this company that does all the vinyl advertisements for kind of bus wrappings and billboards around the Midwest, and I talked them into giving me a lot of their kind of misprints and scraps and things. So again, it's kind of working with this idea of the accident, and then kind of making it taking the accident and making it very purposeful, and combine it with these kind of colors that reference commercial culture. But when designing the space, the Cultural Arts Center is this huge building and had a lot of different options on the venue, but I was really responded to the symmetry of the space, and a lot of this is kind of a reference to the Rorschach kind of ink blot test. Because I started doing a lot of research into advertisement and marketing, and it turns out a lot of these major corporations use these ink blot tests to try to capture the identity of their logos, which is a very kind of common practice. And I think there's a natural kind of link with the paint splat and the Rorschach test. But as we move on to the next image here, you notice in the window there, I actually fabricated those blinds myself out of canvas. So I like the idea of the painting itself starts to become part of the environment. And then the composition, the kind of long and kind of repeating these kind of column forms. And this time around I also chose to specifically limit the number of different type of paint splats and paint drips that I would use to kind of emphasize this idea of kind of repetition and pattern. But even like the imagery is pretty random, and that's by choice. I was thinking about the way these images are kind of disseminated out into the world, and the way we encounter these images. We don't really choose which advertisements we come across. They're just kind of thrown in our face whether we want it or not. And they kind of find ways to seep themselves into our consciousness. And we see the detail here. This kind of gives you an idea of some of the intricacies of how these shapes are kind of cut out. And I liked how it started to function almost as a abstracted version of like a billboard or like a corporate logo. So there's still this combination of abstract expressionism and pop art, But I think there's a kind of turning point where I started using these found images, and that's kind of shifted, you know, my studio practice even up to today.
Right.
And I think here now, the medium itself with the vinyl not only helps kind of reference, you know, the content, it really becomes the content itself.
Right. Okay. Windows in New York City are the site for this next exhibition, which was also done in 2009, entitled Limited Time Only. Here the site itself is a retail space, and that kind of echoes the commercial content of the images you're using. Yet the art itself isn't actually selling anything. It's kind of more of a pattern that's pulled out of the barrage of advertising that we have with us all the time.
And, you know, again, I like your analysis because it's like you hit on the points that I was kind of going for. So in a way, it's not selling us anything, but in a way, it's trying to sell us everything. You know, and like you said, the barrage of this advertisement imagery, and you know, designing this piece, I was really thinking about the location, and nowhere else in the world are you bombarded with imagery and advertisements like New York City.
Right.
And with this piece, I wanted to kind of move away from the drip form and start to focus on you know, the work starting to become a bit more geometric, and I think its own personal aesthetics. And then, you know, I saw the space, and it really functioned as this large canvas that kind of looked out into the world. And the format itself almost looked like a Pollock painting. You know, it's really kind of elongated. So I wanted to create a composition that was quite similar. You know, one that's just full of rhythm and kind of repetition and pattern. It really didn't have a beginning or an end. And I like that. I think that kind of emphasizes this high-speed, kind of fast-paced nature of New York, to where you there's all these images and messages trying to grab you, and you can't really focus on one before another one's trying to pull your attention away. And as we move to a detail image here, I'm still working with these vinyl advertisements, but this time around I like the idea of kind of cropping them down to where it's almost like these little snippets of information, you know, almost as like a bus passes by and you just catch a little bit of an advertisement, or if you're on a train and happen to see a little bit of a billboard. But
it's almost like stream of consciousness.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think that was part of it, but and also in doing this, and which also has become relevant in my current work, it really starts to highlight, you know, how these images are targeting consumers. You know, how are they really trying to lure them in, you know, and persuade them to buy their products. And you know, if we look at, you know, back to the previous image, there was this close, you know, cropped down image of these kind of big luscious lips or high heels, which kind of suggests this, you know, sexual kind of, you know, sensual qualities to try to lure viewers. Or even this one, where it's like flashing money or business tie, gives this illusion of success. So it's almost kind of pointing out these tendencies that we're really trying to capture viewers to buy products. You know?
Okay. In 2010, you had a larger exhibition called Floating at the Fidon Center for the Creative Arts in Hamilton, Ohio. Here, I think you focus more on transforming existing images from advertising into your own new compositions in acrylic and vinyl. I think you've also shared with your viewers the sources for some of those original images.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. I think this was, again, another kind of transition show that the work starts to become a bit more minimal, in part, you know, by design, and it starts to become a bit more geometric also. And as we move throughout the space, it's also transitioning that I'm starting to make more permanent objects in conjunction with these installations. So as we see a couple of images, there was some works on canvas, some kind of vinyl installation on the floor, as well as kind of a mixture of vinyl and acrylic on the wall. And then there's also these display cases where I created these compositional arrangements of these found images. And these all come from, I have a huge collection of, you know, anytime I come across, you know, an image that some of them are kind of vintage advertisements, some of them are kind of contemporary, but I think, you know, so they're definitely not just out there to just really show the viewer where the sources come from. You know, each of them I kind of think of it as a piece, and there's a lot of thought went into the arrangements. But this is somewhat of a transition that, you know, instead of working with these vinyl kind of advertisements that are kind of contemporary and I think for the most part recognizable to the viewer, these are images that, you know, someone may or may not really recognize or know. They're just something that kind of I came across by chance. And you know, whether it was a visual component or conceptual component, really I had this, you know, emotional response to it. So, and that's kind of changed the work, and that's pretty much how I work now. And you'll notice within the arrangements, you'll start to find the sources, like you mentioned, for the installations and the work on canvas. I think the most obvious is the vintage kind of 45 record sleeve,
Right.
and that became the design format for the centerpiece. In a way, I thought this was a kind of new way of working, but when you think about it, it's actually very similar to the very first project. I was working with these kind of paint drips, which is kind of arbitrary, and then turn it into very grand. And here I'm using this kind of very common, kind of everyday image that I just happen to come across.
Yeah.
But this time around, I was starting to reference, instead of abstract expressionism, I was thinking a lot more about 1960s geometric minimalism.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. And artists like Silhouette and Frank Stella, someone I'm definitely kind of thinking about. But I like the idea that these images are, like I said, they're kind of common, somewhat everyday and kind of thought of as low art or low culture,
Yeah.
but then presented in a way that kind of references these specific movements in art history, which society claims is to be high art or high culture, the
Right.
complete opposite,
Yeah.
So there's this kind of, subtle paradox there, and I'm starting to kind of raise questions about authenticity in the work.
Yeah.
Which is, can be a sensitive subject, but we move on. Again, this next piece is kind of loosely taken from this, advertisement image I came across. It's actually something from the 80s, and I say loosely. I definitely made my own alterations. And you'll see that the panel on the right is actually on canvas. It's a combination of vinyl and acrylic on canvas, and then the work on the left is actually directly on the wall. These little snippets of these kind of vinyl.
Okay, so
vinyl
those circles
circles.
are actually vinyl?
Yeah, they are.
Okay. This next exhibition is Biennial 26, and this was held at the South Bend Museum of Art in 2011. It's a series of collages composed by hand, then scanned into a computer for further manipulation. And in the final product, the color of each image is printed digitally on canvas, while the black of the image is screen printed. So I'll just let you comment a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. Again, these images come from that same kind of collection that we saw in the previous one that we looked at. So again, I'm making this again another transition into making kind of lasting objects, but also trying to think about how this kind of works on canvas can kind of hold on their own, as well as kind of work in conjunction with this kind of larger installation. So when designing this piece, I did some research into the venue in the South Bend Museum of Art. I don't know if you've ever been there. It was the first time ever going, but doing the research, the building itself is quite unique. It's actually one large kind of right triangle that the architect designed. And I think with my new kind of interest in geometry and kind of this geometric minimalism, and not just the space itself, even like a lot of the galleries and the corridors inside are actually kind of broken up in these right triangles. So it kind of seemed like a natural design element to exploit.
Right.
But I call this piece, I titled it Motion and Stability. I think when, in designing this, I started out, I created a model of the space and worked, in part by computer, composing it there, but also would print them out and kind of play around with the arrangements. It seemed like, the piece started to be all about this, the contrast between this very dynamic, kind of motion-based tensions versus very kind of static, kind of geometric systems. But I think, in retrospect, kind of looking back, it was very much a kind of formal exploration and kind of a new design kind of exploration. I was really teaching myself how to screen print, too.
Okay. This particular one brings up a question I had. I'm curious as how you decided what images to join and when to superimpose geometric patterns. Do you use trial and error, or do you have a plan or a system in mind?
I mean, it's definitely trial and error. I mean, I think that the whole nature of kind of working in collage is very much a kind of trial and error process. I think it's, to make something successful, you have to kind of keep playing around and trying different kind of combinations and arrangements until you find what really works. Right. So for this, particular image, I knew that I wanted to use these images of the skiers in relationship to the other images in the installation. I remember when I came across it, I was really kind of struck by this dynamic kind of movement of it. And I want to contrast that by having something really kind of sharp and geometric. And, so I went back to that collection that I have, and I've got a lot of this is actually a kind of vintage logos. And this one really struck me. And I probably tried about 10 different combinations, so I found which one that I liked the best. And this one, I really like the kind of three-dimensional qualities. The R's almost feel like they're popping off the page. And part of that's just the perspective in which it's designed, and part the color choices that I use really kind of enhance that, and the saturation. But and I think another reason why I was kind of drawn to it, I mean, the R's almost reminded me of like early 20th century Swiss design. I don't know if the Swiss are kind of known for their early 20th century design, and it's very common they would use these very kind of sharp geometric kind of angles in these logos, and I don't think there's anything really more Swiss than a bunch of skiers. So I don't know. It's more of a kind of my kind of joking side coming through.
That's great. Okay, now your newest work puts together disparate images to create some striking compositions that are often a commentary on contemporary life. The source material for the ones we're going to be looking at is exhibition advertisements from the leading contemporary art periodical, Art Forum International.
Yeah.
So it's sort of art commenting on art a little bit here.
Yeah. I mean, that's it definitely is, and you know, with these, I think a great part of it is I wanted the idea of kind of taking two kind of separate, kind of unrelated advertisements, and then finding ways to kind of merge them together where it kind of, at first glance, maybe seems kind of banal or somewhat normal, but then by the second look, you know, the way you study a little bit more, there's things that are kind of odd and you know, quite unusual. So instead of having, you know, juxtaposing these images kind of side by side to kind of make you think about their content differently, I'm kind of dissecting the images and kind of merging them together. So in reality, I'll probably look through hundreds before I find two that really marry well together.
Yeah.
And I know we're just kind of looking at a couple, but you know, it's a pretty large series. I've done about 50 of these. I haven't quite exhibited them yet.
The one on the left here is Illusion of Desire, and the one on the right is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, there's obviously kind of joking kind of nature in it. But again, I think this goes back to starting to highlight, you know, these, you know, how these images are trying to target consumers, which is, you know, for me a kind of a very sensitive subject when, you know, these are advertisements for art exhibitions, you know, which, you know, so it's really kind of questioning the role of marketing in the contemporary art world, which, you know, I'm sure any scholar, if you asked them, you know, they would think, you know, what art sells really shouldn't define whether it's good or not. So it's this kind of interesting, you know, kind of fine line there, where there's, you know, kind of, you know, if advertising sole purpose is to sell you something, I think, you know, does that really determine the buyer that they're purchasing something just because they think it's good, or they really have this love for it, or is it someone telling them to purchase this? I don't know. So that's kind of underlying thing. A lot of are other kind of personal commentaries.
Okay, and these two are primary stripes on the left and night on the right, which is really striking.
Yeah, thanks. And the process is kind of very similar, kind of taking multiple images and kind of splicing them together. This is an example where I actually took the collage and then would scan it into the computer and then manipulate it further using, you know, Photoshop and Illustrator. So a lot of it's, you know, I would in part kind of remove some text. Other things I'm kind of repeating forms, adding different kind of shapes, kind of alter some of the colors. So there's just kind of back and forth process between the hand and the machine, or kind of digital and analog.
Yeah. Okay, and Future on the left and Fluorescent Love on the right. Future is great. It just grabs you. It's one of those images. It's like, whoa. Yeah,
yeah. Thanks. And that's why you know, maybe we're done. I'll show the original. But it just so happened I found, you know, that the colors almost matched perfectly. These two totally different images, and the width of the kind of sailor sitting on the edge of this boat. I mean, it fit perfectly. It's just by chance, you know. And I think that's. The piece is very much, you know, you spend it as
like deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah.
It just hit me. Sorry.
As they're like staring down to this abyss. But this is one of those examples, and I know it doesn't kind of show well in a reproduction of one that I would print digitally or print the color of the image digitally on canvas, and I would screen print the black, which when you see it in person, you can see the dot grain and the conversation between the two. And a lot of that's, again, thinking about you know, the way in which I present the work can help inform the content. And, you know, today all these media images are presented, you know, through a digital realm,
Mm-hmm.
where traditionally everything was kind of screen printed or
Right.
different forms of letterpress. So
Right.
it's kind of referencing these kind of contemporary and kind of dated forms of printed media.
Right. Okay. One more question for you would
Yeah,
be,
sure.
which contemporary artists do you think have influenced your art?
A lot. I obviously kind of pull from art history a lot, but I think contemporary, I really like, in terms of collage, I like John Stetzeker. He's this, he's actually been working from about the 70s, but he works with collage in a very minimal way, kind of in part kind of how I like. He often takes almost kind of headshots or from film stills, and will combine it with like postcards or landscapes, but does his act of collaging is very minimal, almost kind of one or two cuts. So there's a certain economy to his process that I like. John Baldessari is another one. He's kind of post pop art, post appropriationist.
Okay.
So he's kind of taking existing images, and he also has this kind of comical side to his work that I kind of respond well. Who else? Kelly Walker is pretty interesting. He's a younger guy based out of New York, and he's also an appropriationist in a way that he takes more kind of iconic imagery, and there's a lot of kind of political undertones with his work. But he also, I think technically, there's things that I respond well to him. He also prints some things digitally on canvas, and then he'll screen print chocolate and like all these kind of unusual. Unusual materials over the image. So.
Right. Okay. Well, that'll be it for today.
Yeah,
then,
thank you so much for having me.
I
Yeah.
really enjoyed this. And also, thank you for watching Art Now. Our guest today has been Michael Willett, and you can see his art online at www.michael-willett.com. And Michael will be in residency this summer at the Prairie Center of the Arts in Peoria, Illinois. We hope you enjoyed today's show, and we also hope it will inspire you to explore the local art scene and to make your own art now.